News around the clock on Power 98.7.
Indeed, what you heard a short while ago, that live press briefing happening in the Oval Office in Washington as President Cyril Ramaphosa concluded his briefing alongside U.S. President Donald Trump. And the tone may have been a bit tense at times at the beginning, but the opportunity for dialogue was unmistakably valuable in this sitting, from trade and investment to rural safety and migration concerns. You know, when you look at today's engagement in the Oval Office, it does mark a critical moment in really rebalancing a relationship that has faced recent strain as well. Ramaphosa acknowledging the need for a stronger rural policing, and he also brought the agriculture minister, also the leader of the DA, John Steenhuisen, into the fold, signaling a willingness to confront real issues while also pushing back on narratives not grounded in verified fact. He was quite clear that South African farmers, by and large, are committed to this country, and that the government is committed to their safety as well. And of course, as the world watches, this meeting may be well remembered not just for the headlines, but for the deeper signal that it sends, that South Africa is prepared to speak clearly, to stand firmly, and work globally as well. You know, so in the next segment, we ask why telling the truth about South Africa matters now more than ever. You know, especially in the age of algorithms and echo chambers, the fight for truth isn't just moral, it's strategic, as we've just seen. This week's high-profile meeting between President Ramaphosa and Trump places South Africa's image on the international stage, and not just our economy. You know, the stakes are indeed high. You know, these exaggerated claims of farmer persecution, political pressure from conservative media outlets, and growing concern in global diplomatic circles. Yet, what Ramaphosa did and must continue to do is quite simple, well, at least in my view. It is also quite powerful to tell the truth with facts and context as well. And maybe let's segue into that conversation right now, bringing in political analyst Professor Patrick Bond to give us his insights. Professor Bond, good to have you on the program this evening. Of course, after this high-profile meeting between President Cyril Ramaphosa and U.S. President Donald Trump, headlines have ranged from hopeful to heated, from these controversial claims about white farmers to issues around trade, cooperation, and rural security as well. But how would you assess South Africa's overall messaging strategy coming out of this meeting?
Oh, thanks for having me in, Frank. I think, like you, disgusted with the way lies have wings. That is, President Ramaphosa was calm, collected. He's as good as you get. There's nobody I've experienced, anyway, in the world who has that capacity to look the opponent in the eye and take their concerns seriously and talk them through and be, very open and honest. And yet Donald Trump provided, especially with that sheaf of papers of a few, there probably were 25 or 30 farm murders and acts of violence against whites that he could turn to. But really, when we have the extraordinarily high crime levels and the worst inequality in the world, and the degrees to which I think the big corporates, including U.S. corporates, are looting.
So Ramaphosa pushed back diplomatically, while also acknowledging real concerns like crime in South Africa and rural safety as well. Was that the right tone to be used, or should we have been more assertive in confronting this misinformation, which clearly has been seen with information being given to the U.S. president?
Oh, I think far more assertiveness would have been appropriate, because, as I was just saying, that these lies are traveling without any grounding. Elon Musk, we could attribute to his X.com and all of the ways, even Grok.com is his own AI, refutes him. In the last few days, you've seen this extraordinary controversy over AI against its owner. So there's no white genocide, and Afrikaner farm murders are far lower than the rest of society witnesses. So what should have happened, I think, is that the two or three areas of strength that Ramaphosa brings, which include credibility, as for example, on the Israeli genocide of Palestinians goes on. You have the UK and France and Canada now beginning to switch sides and being against Israel. Donald Trump, obviously, very, very much in Israel's camp, wanted to relocate 1 million people from Gaza to Libya. All of these mean, especially climate, the U.S. aid cuts that affect our AIDS and healthcare programs, the food aid to places like Sudan, the destruction of trade and financial markets. This was a time where Ramaphosa could have, been cheeky with absolute support from the rest of the world and said, Donald Trump, do you want to be in the G20? Why should we hand to you? Why don't we make it a G19 and vote you off the island? And I think only Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, maybe Claudia Maloney in Giorgia Meloni in Italy, and Javier Milei in Argentina would be again, siding with Trump with the rest of the G20. This guy, he just cannot actually perform as a global leader.
Professor Bond, I'm not sure if you saw it, but interesting for me during this presentation that we just saw were images and videos that President Trump played in the Oval Office to the entourage that President Ramaphosa brought forward with him as well, including the likes of Remgro's Johan Rupert, as well as Ernie Els as well, and other sportsmen as well, but also accompanying this delegation, this high-profile delegation of government ministers, including members of the opposition. But he played a clip that included footage of, for instance, EFF leader Julius Malema chanting "Kill the Boer, kill the farmer" in previous remarks that he made at public events as well. But looking at Donald Trump's overall stance during this briefing, he referenced fears on white farmers and also used stark language as well during his presentation. What impact does this kind of rhetoric have, especially on bilateral relations and on South Africa's image globally?
It shows again that Donald Trump ultimately is a performer. He had this TV show, The Apprentice, and it's that sort of Hollywood or TV-oriented kind of politics that he's become infamous for, which distorts the truth. And in the case of Malema, I think actually Ramaphosa handled it just fine, saying this is a 10% party. It doesn't represent the policies of the government. There's no kill the Boer, kill the race. It's an old, it's an old song. It doesn't have any meaning in policy. There's a bit of land reform. It's very, very slow, obviously. And so what white farmers, what Johan Rupert acknowledged, aside from crime, what he acknowledged is that there's nothing like a genocide. Now, what that means is if you were Ramaphosa and you could say, well, President Trump, do your police in the U.S. shoot black people and therefore generate a Black Lives Matter movement far more than white people? I would have done that. Or I would have asked about all the ways that the U.S. Army has committed mass criminality in places from Iraq and Afghanistan. Yeah. You could go back to Vietnam. There'd be many ways you could do some jiu-jitsu. And Ramaphosa was too polite, I think too supplicant. And in a time when there's a sort of spirit, let me call it, of anti-imperialism, where Donald Trump is overstepping the mark on so many issues, it's a bit of a shame that President Ramaphosa plays a sub-imperial. He goes with the flow. He doesn't want to challenge the premises, and he therefore looks very uncomfortable when he's being shown some performative shots of Julius Malema.
Professor Bond, if you'll allow me to still keep you on for a few more minutes as well as we continue to track developments on this very important story. A meeting that was about more than diplomacy. It was about, or rather is about, dignity, narrative, and this battle for perception in a world quick to judge and slow to fact check, if you will. As we've heard, South Africa faces not just economic or security challenges in the form of crime, but a messaging challenge on the global stage as well. Big thank you to all our guests who will be joining us as we continue reacting to this story as well.
The day's business top stories on Power 98.7.
Of course, the time now is 25 minutes to the hour 8 o'clock, and still more to come on this high-profile meeting between President Cyril Ramaphosa and his U.S. Counterpart, that's President Donald Trump. And really the headlines have ranged from hopeful to heated, from conversational or rather controversial claims about white farmers to even talk about trade and cooperation and issues around rural security as well. Still have my guest, Professor Patrick Bond, on the line to give us political analysis on this. I'm also very excited to announce here in studio that we do have a usual contributor to the program, Ndumiso Mngomezulu, to also help us navigate this discussion. And Ndumiso, maybe let me start with you. You know, this has been a very high-profile meeting that's taking place in the Oval Office, but am I wrong to read the room and say it sounded like Ramaphosa and his team are being summoned to the principal's office this time around?
Absolutely. I mean, just even from the optics, at some point I think I was going through social media and people were saying, we've been waiting, where is the president? And at some point I thought, the president is late, is it a South African thing? And I saw a response from artists saying, we're waiting for the White House protocol to tell us when to arrive. And the shift of the program in itself, where at some point there was supposed to be a lunch, and then later there was a lot of optics and power play from just how things were moving. And it did feel to some extent that we were really not in control. The discussion, when you look at just body language between President Trump and President Ramaphosa, where President Ramaphosa consistently trying to find, a comma or a semicolon so that he can enter the conversation and be able to contribute substantively so. What was interesting also is that, in the conversation, Ramaphosa tried to bring in substantive matters to discuss, but President Trump was very sensational, as we know. And it almost really reinforced this thing where the principal was like, you are guilty and you are naughty and you are going to hear from me. So certainly there was that dynamic. I mean, look, I do think that President Ramaphosa stood his ground and was able to get through some conversation, that anybody can hear and listen to. But certainly the optics leading up to and the play in the room, beside the substantive matters, did show that we were in the principal's office.
Ndumiso, it's so interesting because in this display of diplomacy, even sport featuring at that at the Oval Office with Radebe as well as the Big Easy, Ernie Els, being given a chance by the US president, who clearly is a big fan of golf, big resorts as well, a developer. But President Ramaphosa joining Trump in this high-profile engagement featuring some of South Africa's most influential figures, from fairways to the boardroom, really. Joining his team, I must say, or joining the head of state, I've mentioned Ernie Els, who not only served as a symbolic bridge between nations, but also emphasized this unifying power of sport in his presentation. Also present was billionaire businessman Johan Rupert from Remgro, representing the country's economic clout on the global stage. Ndumiso, what was your assessment of the individuals in the room?
I mean, first, let's acknowledge that President Ramaphosa was walking a tightrope. Yeah. And he's been walking a tightrope for a while. And I think, despite who and how the individuals landed up in the room, let's acknowledge the role of soft power and diplomacy in that extent, where sport becomes a big vehicle to bridge gaps, to bring people together and strengthen connections. And I think that's what you saw at display here, that, sectors like the arts, the culture, the sport don't just sit as just sectors for entertainment, but rather have got a very important role to play. And I think this was a great display of soft power and the importance of such sectors in being able to bridge difficult conversations and ease tensions. And I certainly think that the presence of the gentleman in there really did do a good job of being able to ease the tensions, to some extent make it really amicable and the conversations to flow in a very tense and tightrope conversation.
Let's bring back Professor Patrick Bond to this conversation as well, from Trump's provocative remarks on white farmers, rural crime as well, to Ramaphosa's calm pushback and strategic inclusion of Agriculture Minister John Steenhuisen. Really, the meeting revealed a complex mix of power play, perception politics, and policy promises. But very interesting to see that Ramaphosa also relied on members of his GNU to help make his case, Professor Bond.
Yes, and I completely agree, Nhlanhla, with Ndumiso's reading of the soft power and the importance of sport. But if you think of what Ramaphosa really self-mandated, which was trade, the big fear is that the 0% tariff benefit, GOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, since George W. Bush, 2003, I think it was, when they started it. And that has allowed companies from the West, like Mercedes and BMW in the auto sector, Ford as well, a U.S. company, but also aluminium from BHP Billiton and steel from ArcelorMittal, based in Luxembourg. And you get these sort of Western companies. I'd add Sasol. You get the vineyards of the Western Cape and ZZ2's plantations in Limpopo, all of them benefiting. And that's now at risk. So to me, the great disappointment was that probably tomorrow, if Trump wakes up and thinks of the friction that we just have witnessed in the Oval Office, he will continue to go through with his, let's call it Liberation Day, which is a 32% overall tariff, cars and aluminium steel have just been hit with a 25% tariff in February. And all of this means that the big effort to keep the relationships of trade and investment and probably finance, given there's a $1 billion plus just energy transition partnership financing from from U.S. banks that are guaranteed by the U.S. government, that's been tossed away. The AIDS program, PEPFAR, that's about 8.5 billion rand a year. And now, Ghana couldn't quite find that today. And all of these really material things were not subject to the kind of rigorous inquiry and debate that we would have wanted.
Of course, that's Professor Patrick Bond, a political economist and a global justice scholar as well, joining us for this conversation. I must also mention that political analyst Jackie Shandu also joins us for this very important discussion, whose work often focuses on racial justice, nationalism, and post-colonial African identity as well. Jackie, let me also welcome you to this very important discussion that we are having. So you've often argued that race still defines global power relations. What did this meeting reveal about how whiteness in the form of the white farmer narrative still dominates how African states are framed and engaged diplomatically as well?
Good evening, and good evening to the listeners, and thank you for having us. I think two key observations for me. One is rather, I would say, obvious and logical in its own weird way. Whiteness inherent in capacity and reluctance to really come to terms with realities that affect black people. Yeah. And it would not be whiteness if it really had a real conscience and it had appetite for actual facts and statistics and the actual truth, as it were. So it's that just hyper-narcissism of whiteness, that whiteness must always be centered and white people must always be centered, that even if you go wrestle with crime statistics of South Africa, and something that is scientifically proven time and again, that black, rural and township working class and poor people are disproportionately affected by crime in South Africa. You can still turn that around. In the face of that empirical evidence, you can still turn it around and marginalize, put black people at the margins, and make white people the center of that discussion, even though science tells you that this discussion should centrally be about black people based on who is far more affected by scourge such as crime. So it comes as no surprise. The other key observation is, the complete incapacity of the leadership that represented South Africa there. Lack of capacity. It's shocking.
Why do you say this?
To articulate.
And how do you cite this lack of capacity? What informs this?
I'm saying Donald Trump was allowed to get away with fiction, utter fiction, and not at once was he fact-checked. Not at once was he told that what he's saying is not true and that his sources have no credibility whatsoever. Right. Not once. He was just allowed to go on, and the only thing we were hearing from the South African delegation was how much the United States should be part of the solution, and we come here to beg, to ask for U.S. technology and U.S. FDI and so on and so forth. It looked like we were going there to report to our master. It was never a bilateral. It was never two sovereign states. Anyone listening, not knowing what was happening, would be forgiven for thinking that we are a protectorate or a colony. Let's put it like that, a colony of America. And as a result, we were going to account to our authority about the goings-on in South Africa. So you never got any assertion, particularly from the president, that I am the leader of South Africa and I'm not coming here to account because South Africa is a sovereign state and we should be engaging as partners on a bilateral basis. It's sad that, our president in particular, cap in hand, begging, pleading, laughing when, there was nothing funny, going all out, groveling and pandering to the whims of whiteness and white racism. Not a good day for black people.
Of course, I'm not alone in studio. I am joined by Ndumiso Mngomezulu, a usual contributor to the program as well, co-anchoring this segment of the show. Ndumiso, maybe let's reflect on what we've discussed so far. And we've said a lot about Trump's language around persecuted white farmers. It did stir controversy. What role do you think this racialized narrative plays in really shaping foreign policy, especially between the U.S. and African nations?
Yeah. I mean, look, I think the first thing which I want to agree with our analyst on the line is that there was a danger of the the virality rhetoric outpacing verification, and you saw that happening there because it was just really rhetoric.
There you go.
Very limited verification that came through. Even the footage that we saw, it was almost like pulling out of social media clips with no verification. The second danger that almost came up was this framing of crime through a racial lens. And you could see a lot of the South African delegation trying to say it's crime across the board, it's crime across the board. And true, there wasn't a voice of authority in that moment to really say, look, let's not racialize crime. Crime is crime, and it happens across the board. But more than anything, you almost could see that this is a conversation that is really driven from a limited lens and understanding of what is happening in South Africa. And really the result of it was a distortion of reality. And it wasn't grounded in national truth at all. And so I think the danger that happened, what could be dangerous around what could happen there is that you have, a lot of people walking out of that discussion probably thinking around the realness of South Africa and where does South Africa really sit in this crime conversation. And I could see that the South African delegation was really trying to move away from this genocide narrative and rhetoric, and really speaking true to crime challenges in the country, to a point where I wondered if we're not doing a disservice to ourselves as a nation in how we are then punting the crime conversation and then having investors thinking, is this the place I want to invest in? As an unintended consequence to try and shift the narrative from this genocide or white genocide or white farmer killing into a rampant crime conversation. I think what it should have been really grounded on is the inequality of South Africa, unemployment challenges, and the economics of the stomach.
There we go.
And not necessarily into crime and then using crime as the base to which to explain unemployment, etc. I think the framing was really misplaced there. But again, it was a tightrope, and the big thing was we want to dispel the genocide conversation at the disservice of potentially the national brand.
If you're just joining us, we're in the midst of a deep dive into the high-stakes Oval Office meeting between Presidents Ramaphosa as well as Trump, unpacking its political, economic and narrative implications for South Africa. And I do know that our listeners are itching and want to add to this conversation as well. Jerry in Litlabile, we do see you. Temba in Mpumalanga, we do see you as well. Hopefully we can catch up with you before the show wraps up. The power line is 0861 987 000. WhatsApp line, that's where you drop us your voice notes. It's 0833037093. Twitter or X, we are at Power FM 987. Do remember the show hashtag is Power Business. Facebook, simply search for Power FM and you'll find us there and add your comment.
Stay connected with the latest news across your world. Power 98.7. Now we're talking.
What would a conversation on Power 98.7 be without our cherished listeners also commenting? We've got, 8 minutes left to this conversation. A quick reminder that we are still with the Professor Patrick Bond, Jackie Shandu as well, still joining us on the line. But let's speak to our listeners right now and catch up with Jerry in Litlabile. Jerry, please make it quick if you can. What's on your mind?
Greetings. Now we are going to be dancing to the bass guitar of United States. because the AGOA agreement, it means that we will have to do away with Chinese imports that are in South Africa because of Ford. You know that Ford is facing a serious crisis in the United States between the relationship with the president. Now, they are going to broaden actually the scope of AGOA. It means that there's the cars that we see. And remember, the South Africans are employed by majority of the NATO countries that are employing South Africans, the likes of Germans, United States. I mean, Ford is there in Mamelodi, and they are developing the community. They are employing a number of people, and we know that they are employing actually over 4,000 direct. Indirect is plus minus 2,000. So it means that we will have to save this motor industry by actually doing away with these cars that we see from China, because of China does not build industries in South Africa, they're just importing. Thank you, my brother.
Thank you so much. Keeping it sweet and short, that's Jerry in Letlhabile. We quickly go to Tuto in Midrand. Tuto, what's on your mind?
How are you, my brother? I hope you can hear me properly because I'm on Bluetooth and driving.
It's not the best. If you can just remove us on the Bluetooth very quickly if you can. We don't have much time.
All right. You can hear me now?
Let's go for it. Let's go for it quickly.
All right. So I've been listening, and I think there's a recurring theme from everyone that is calling. And this recurring theme is people are drawing conclusion from a preliminary, because this briefing is more about this is why we are here,
right,
and this is what we are going to be discussing. But everyone was listening to this hoping that there will be some kind of detail, some kind of result coming from this particular press briefing.
Does it not set the tone, though, for the discussions set to happen next?
Pardon?
Does it not help us understand the tone for these discussions that are set to happen next?
Absolutely. So the tone is that Trump wants to dive deep into what is happening in South Africa with white crime or the crime against white people. And in South Africa, they said, we are going to touch on that, but we are also here because we want to discuss the trading. It is important to us that we rekindle the relationship between U.S. and South Africa. So it is not necessarily something where we are going to watch this now, this preliminary press briefing, and hear debate and fact-checking and all of those things. Those things are still going to happen in the course of the week. This was just the leader stating what is important to them about this particular meeting.
Let's go to Soshanguve as well. Thanks a lot, Tuto in Midrand. I'm flying through these calls because I want to get as much of your opinions as possible before we get closing remarks from our contributor and our guests as well this evening. Let's go to Tshwane and speak to Zweli. Zweli, what's on your mind this evening? Please keep it sweet and short.
Hello.
Zweli, you are on the line.
Yes. I just wanted to, basically, I think the president really, this was like an affront to every black person in the country. No pushback whatsoever. And it's clear that you and Rupert and the other guys, they were there for something else. It was not for South Africa. Because if you are someone looking at that and you didn't know the details.
Really, I'm going to cut you short, not because we don't want to hear your comment, but simply because the line is bad. Let's quickly go to Kabelo in Soshanguve to wrap up our calls before we conclude the show. Kabelo, what's on your mind?
Can you hear me?
Loud and clear. Go ahead. Go for it.
Yeah, you know what? This press conference, it was not about trade negotiation. I think it was Donald Trump has got something to benefit out of this. He knows the world is being occupied, the population of our land in South Africa is being occupied by these rebels. Trump is a racist. America is up to date 24/7. They have an embassy in South Africa. There's no way that they can know only white people are being killed. What about the black people? No, to leave that one aside. Now he comes there, he calls Ramaphosa as if he's going to make a trade union. But he knows internally it's not about the trade union. He's going to roast Ramaphosa. Ramaphosa is a smart man, but he's not a fast thinker like Julius Malema. Now he's making propositions about Julius Malema, trying to edit where it fits him over. And then over a song which is a veteran song, was sang during the apartheid era. He's still sang up to now. He's taken that in a sense of saying, the guy is sending a message to say, kill the white, kill the boom. He doesn't even know how to do a homework to make a proposition position to influence people. Everyone can see directly this is a pure lie. Now he shows people lining up with cars saying they are going to the funeral, people have been killed. He's asking him directly, where is this area? He can't even answer. Now he shows people who are dying. What if those pictures are the people who have been died out of the heinous crimes that are happening in South Africa? And why must he concentrate only on the white people? Meanwhile, they are the ones who are having the land, who are having the wealth. With Johan Rupert, we've been told of this guy. He's the one who's controlling South Africa. Radebe went to his place. Now he's coming to America.
Get me into trouble.
And he has made a negotiation with Donald Trump.
Kabelo, you're going to get me into trouble because of time, Kabelo. I have to wrap up that call as well. But Ndumiso, maybe as we wrap as well, a lot being said by our listeners around Ramaphosa's balancing act, or just the presentation that he gave to the US president. I'm quite surprised he didn't just simply say, in the events leading up to this, he's been saying that the US president has been lied to. But nowhere during this presentation, if I'm not mistaken, did he indeed say to the American president that President Trump, the fact is simple. The people who are telling you about all this nonsense, if you will, about South Africa are simply lying to you. Why wasn't it as explicit today?
Yeah, and interestingly, I did think he was going to be explicit. There was a point where he said, "I want to respond," and I thought he's literally going to be the president who said, "Trump, keep your America, we keep our South Africa." I was expecting that bold and vigor, but I also understand that President Ramaphosa, like I said, was walking a tightrope, and also at the backdrop of all of this, we've seen what happened with Zelensky. So there was almost this play of, I don't want the repeat of Zelensky. I want to create a different environment. I want to come with a diplomatic approach. Several times quoting Nelson Mandela, who was around, bringing people around a table to chat and have conversations. But again, the audience that he had in President Trump and his approach is a different audience to what the rhetoric and the approaches of President Nelson Mandela would be. So I think there was a misreading of that situation and the misreading of his audience that required a little bit of a strong hand and potentially some strong words to unequivocally say this is not true.
But are we expecting too much from the president to be more firm, given the sensitivities around this type of discussion that's playing out right now?
I think we're not expecting too much of him. And here's the truth. When South Africa is painted as a lawless racial battleground, the damage goes beyond the headlines and the conversations that are being said in the room or, press conferences. It erodes investor confidence. It distorts national identity. It also undermines the progress in addressing crime and inequality in our own country. So credibility is important, and also being unequivocal from a president here to put the context of South Africa is a very important thing to do, particularly also for markets, because it becomes a market issue. Yeah. Our investors are not only sitting in the US, they are all over the world. And that display and that meeting that we saw was not just for Trump. It was for the rest of the world to restore that confidence beyond the headlines and what we've been saying. So I think we are expecting a lot for him, and rightfully so, because right now he is carrying the balance of South Africa in that conversation.
Ndumiso Mngomezulu, thank you so much for making this conversation even more layered as we continue looking at what's happening in Washington, that all-important meeting between the South African delegation led by President Cyril Ramaphosa, meeting Donald Trump's team, or US President Donald Trump's team. Of course, those talks are anticipated to be continuing even as we speak. A conversation, one that touched on diplomacy, disinformation, economic stakes, but also the deep narratives that continue to shape South Africa's image, especially on the world stage. From the Oval Office optics to the voices of power in the room, and this contested story told about this country. Today's discussion reminds us that perception is political and silence is very costly as well.